Good morning. Or to those of you joining remotely from other time zones, good afternoon, good evening. What an absolute joy, a privilege and an honor it is to be finally welcoming you here today to Nature-Based Solutions Conference 2022. To this beautiful venue, the Natural History Museum at the University of Oxford. Now, before our conversation begins, before all the words begin, I'd like us to take a few moments to arrive, to reflect on why it is we're here and what we're hoping to achieve over the next few days as we listen to some sounds from our one and only home, planet Earth. So we are here to discuss the critical issue of our time. How do we solve the interlinked crises of climate change and biodiversity loss, whilst also increasing the quality of life for all beings on this precious but imperiled planet? Put another way, perhaps more practically, how do we get from where we are now, living among very badly degraded landscapes and cityscapes that are increasingly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, to where we desperately need to be, when we know we need to be, living as part of flourishing social and ecological communities? Now, many of us had hoped to gather 2 years ago to address this very question, but the COVID-19 pandemic meant that this event, like so many others, had to be postponed. Now, since then, the world has, of course, changed considerably. We've had a global pandemic, supply chain crises, failing economies, accelerating and increasingly severe impacts of climate change. And now we have a war in Europe, we have a war in Ukraine. Set against this dismal backdrop, there is a glimmer of hope, born of the realization that we have to tackle these challenges together rather than in isolation from one another, because they share many of the same drivers and hence many of the same solutions. In particular, over the last 2 to 3 years, we have seen a very rapid rise of nature-based solutions on business, policy, and research agendas. Here, for example, in this global map, we see how many nations had included nature-based solutions in their updated nationally determined contributions by the end of 2021. The red dots denote those countries that use the words nature-based. And here we see the increase in published research featuring nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions since the term was first coined back in 2008. Now, this growing popularity is based on perceived or increasingly documented evidence of the effectiveness, the readiness, the scalability, and the affordability of nature-based solutions compared to technological approaches, some of which are certainly necessary, but all of which are only nascent. It also reflects broader recognition of the deep interdependency of societal well-being and ecosystem health. In other words, Western science has finally caught up with that which indigenous people have known for a long time. The uptake also reflects mounting evidence that the costs of failing to act on climate change and biodiversity loss far exceed the costs of action. And yet, despite this, and despite the broader uptake, many of you will be aware, many of you were there. In the final days of the negotiations at COP26 in Glasgow, the term nature-based solution was removed from the Climate Pact. What instead remained was a commitment by the Pact's 197 signatories to recognise the critical role of protecting, conserving and restoring nature and ecosystems in delivering benefits for climate adaptation and mitigation, whilst ensuring social and environmental safeguards. Now, so although it could be claimed that nature-based solutions are included in all but name, What COP26 and other meetings have since revealed were many tensions, lots of discomfort around the term nature-based solutions. And these meetings have revealed two starkly contrasting narratives about nature-based solutions. On the one hand, many organizations and governments are embracing the approach as an essential tool for tackling the climate crisis. On the other hand, some nations and a great many grassroots organizations have firmly dismissed nature-based solutions as a dangerous distraction from systemic change. Now, I believe that these contrasting narratives partly reflect uncertainty in the underlying evidence, but they also reflect controversies about how nature-based solutions are conceptualized and implemented. In particular, you'll be aware there are major concerns that nature-based solutions are being used in greenwashing. In other words, those organizations responsible for ongoing damage to the climate and the biosphere and the wealthy nations that subsidize them are investing in so-called nature-based solutions programs without also doing everything they possibly can to rapidly phase out fossil fuel use across all parts of their operations. Now, this is a dangerous situation. The science is very, very clear that nature-based solutions are not an alternative to keeping fossil fuels in the ground. Many of us here have been saying this over and over again. The science is very clear on this. And unless we rapidly phase out fossil fuels, the resultant warming will turn the biosphere into a net source of greenhouse gases. There are also serious concerns that projects mislabeled, in our view, as nature-based solutions are involving land grabs and violations of human rights and/or causing harm or causing net harm to native biodiversity, with many examples of projects such as these two, one in Cambodia and one in Uganda, both established in the name of carbon offsetting, climate emissions offsetting, but both resulting in very poor outcomes for local communities, very poor outcomes for biodiversity, as well as likely net losses of carbon from the ecosystems involved. So now we get to the mission of this conference and why we're all here. So 2 years ago, really the intention had been to focus this event on really looking at the underlying evidence, in other words, the why of nature-based solutions. However, while we will be certainly investigating the evidence, exploring the evidence, we recognize that globally, internationally, the narrative has shifted more to the how. And so this is the main focus of our discussions over the coming days. How do we ensure that nature-based solutions support thriving human societies and ecosystems without compromising efforts to keep fossil fuels in the ground? And I urge you to keep this challenge, this mission in mind throughout the sessions and throughout your conversations. So we're going to be addressing this over 3 sessions across 3 days. Today, the focus is on policy definitions and the role of nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation and net zero. The first session, which will take place after coffee, will clarify the current position of NbS in multilateral policy process and will outline the current criticisms and tensions that this conference will attempt to address. It will dissect what happened at COP26, another key meeting since then, and explore, discuss with you, our audience, in person and online, what needs to happen by COP27. The second session after lunch will involve speakers exploring the social, scientific, political, economic context of nature-based solutions, including origins and evolving definitions. What counts as a nature-based solution? Who gets to decide? And this session will also explore the issue of nature for people versus nature and people, among other critical issues. And then the final session of this afternoon will review the potential of nature-based solutions to support climate change mitigation, and it will also explore how we address the issue of greenwashing. And explore the role of nature-based solutions in net zero too, and compare offsetting versus insetting schemes. So let me conclude my opening remarks with this. On the 30th of June, 1860, the biologist Thomas Henry Huxley and the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, had the first public debate on Darwin and Wallace's theory of evolution by natural selection as part of an event to mark the opening of this magnificent building. What became known as the Great Debate centered on what was the critical scientific issue of the time, or philosophical, religious issue of the time, really, how new species formed and how the extraordinary diversity of life on Earth came to be. Now, the most critical issue is not so much understanding how this diversity arose, though that is a fascinating question, but how are we going to ensure that it isn't irrecoverably lost and our own existence with it? Key to addressing this is to take a whole systems approach and to work across disciplines and sectors, to collaborate, to communicate, to listen and embrace diverse views and approaches, which is why I'm delighted that among this conference's 962 delegates, we have such a diverse group of experts from across science, policy, practice, business, and from different parts of the world. So welcome, all of you. Before I go on to introduce the speakers for this morning's plenary session, I have some practical information that I need to communicate with you. There are no fire drills planned, so if you do hear a fire alarm, please evacuate through the main entrance and gather on the front lawn in front of the Sequoia. When you need the bathrooms, there are 2 sets at either end of the 2 staircases. From 10 till 5, you'll notice that the general public are in the main exhibit space. Catering and posters are on the upper gallery. We're welcome to help yourself to coffee and tea, and we'll be served lunch, but we ask that you just keep all the food in the upper gallery rather than taking it downstairs. So you are free to go and explore the exhibits if you so wish. And I also wanted to mention that if you have any questions, the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative team do have these green lanyards. There's also information about the program on the program you should have picked up together with your lanyard. There's a QR code. If you scan this, you'll also get a wealth of information, notices about this meeting, and other relevant materials. So please do check that. For the tweeters amongst you, for those on social media, this is our hashtag and our Twitter handle. We would appreciate some coverage. Okay. So now to move to the opening remarks. It gives me pleasure to introduce our first 2 speakers. First, you will hear from Right Honourable Lord Goldsmith of Richmond Park. Lord Goldsmith is the Minister for Pacific and the Environment at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and also the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. This will be followed by a message from Inga Andersen, the Under Secretary General of the United Nations and the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme.
Hello everyone, I wish I was with you in beautiful Oxford, but it is a pleasure to be able to say a few words remotely. And I know that I'm speaking now to a hugely well-informed group of people, so I'm not going to burden you with all the facts, figures and arguments that you undoubtedly already know, other than to reiterate the obvious, that by degrading the natural world as we are doing, we're also derailing complex and critically important natural systems on which each and every one of us relies on for everything. So notwithstanding the very real challenges we face now, putting the pandemic behind us, facing up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, reversing this trajectory is nevertheless the single greatest challenge that we faced as a species, and failure to do so will be utterly devastating. Now, it's daunting, not least because the evidence has been so clear for so long, and yet we continue to move backwards. But we can, I think, be optimistic about the future, and we can be optimistic for a number of good reasons. First, we know the demand for change is huge. It's self-evident from people at every level of society and all around the world. And as a minister, I really feel that pressure growing all the time, and I hugely welcome it. Second, and thanks to many of you, we have the knowledge that we need to turn things around and all the tools we need to do it. And on that note, I'm delighted that we're investing up to £40 million in the new Global Centre for Biodiversity and Climate to draw together expertise from across disciplines and around the world and to rapidly scale up investment in nature. And third, there are pockets of inspiring leadership all around the world. And I think it is probably true to say that everything we need to do is already being done by someone, somewhere. And that if we took those islands of best practice, if they became the default, then we'd be where we need to be. And finally, we've all seen that given even half a chance, nature will recover. And the beauty of backing nature is that when you do, you're solving so many other problems at the same time: hunger, poverty, pollution, and even, as we now know, pandemics, and both the causes and impacts of climate change. And that's why, as the COP26 presidents, one of the key things we set out to do was to bring nature from the margins of the global climate debate into the heart of our response to it. And I can't see any future climate conference being able to set that aside. Our job in the UK is now to ensure those commitments that we secured in Glasgow are honoured in full and that we ramp them up significantly. And in a year that's full of opportunities to turn the tide, perhaps the most important thing that we must all do is to make the UN Biodiversity Conference a Paris moment for nature. We need an ambitious new framework with a clear mission to halt and reverse biodiversity loss globally during this decade, and that must include targets to protect at least 30% of the world's land and at least 30% of the world's ocean by the end of this decade, with mechanisms to enable us to hold countries to account for the promises that are made. And I'm proud to say that behind the scenes, as well as doing all we can through negotiations, the UK is leading a coalition of like-minded partners working together to give nature-rich countries the confidence they need to sign up to high ambition. Part of that means rapidly scaling up investment in nature from all sources, and by securing commitments to use public money in a way that supports the public good rather than degrading it, and to use every lever we have to help the market recognize the true value of the natural world and to make pollution, degradation, waste, and so on an unbearable financial liability. And it's a huge challenge, but it's an unavoidable challenge. And at a time when people, particularly young people, are beginning to despair of a future that they feel they have very little power to influence or change, redoubling our efforts, making good on our promises, and working together in good faith is key not only to putting nature on a road to recovery, but to renewing the trust between people and power that is now fragile to the point of breaking. So I want to thank you once again for all that you do, and I wish you all the best for the rest of this enormously important conference. Thank you so much.
Well, let me first thank the University of Oxford for this invitation. It's a great honor to speak at the Nature-Based Solutions Conference 2022, something that we have discussed with the organizers for some time, whether we should do that. And of course, this conference aims at ensuring that nature's solutions contribute to human and ecological communities so that they are truly able to thrive. Because we can all agree that we are not yet there, so there's a lot of work to be done. I speak to you from Nairobi, and I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I was very keen to have the chance to address you today. Look, many of you may have heard me speak to this, but we at UNEP, we've sort of come to the conclusion that humanity has sort of sleepwalked its way into what we refer to as a triple planetary crisis: the crisis of climate change, the crisis of nature and biodiversity loss, and the crisis of pollution and waste. And we see that crisis in heat waves and in extreme weather events. We see it in the billions of hectares of degraded lands and in species extinction. And we see it in the death and ill health caused by pollution of the air, of the land, and of the water that we drink or from which we fish. So really, when we think about all of this, we have to understand that it is thanks to science and to the environmental movement, the world has kind of begun to wake up. The international community has shown an increasing will to act with a force and with a speed, maybe not right at the speed that I would like it to be, but nevertheless to begin to halt that triple planetary crisis. The broader environmental movement has made that very, very clear, and it is increasingly on the docket of prime ministers and cabinets across the world. This community that is involved and trying to step up has shown that it is really more clearly understood that we have to keep nature healthy, because it's only when we keep nature healthy that we keep ourselves healthy. Now, at the last climate COP in Glasgow, COP26, we saw a clear commitment beginning to emerge inside the climate conversations on nature, and this is a huge breakthrough. And we certainly are very grateful to the UK hosts for really pushing and putting nature on the agenda at the climate COP. This hasn't really happened before. We spoke in previous COPs about ecosystem-based adaptation and so on, but not really putting it squarely on the docket. And so when we look at the Glasgow Declaration, we saw world leaders commit to conserve and restore forest, and the same for other terrestrial ecosystems. And also we saw that and heard these commitments of the $19 billion that was pledged in Glasgow to help protect and restore forests globally. This is big. We've had promises before, but we're actually beginning to see some of these $19 billion beginning to emerge, so that's a good thing. We also, as part of that pledge, we saw this $1 billion pledge to help support indigenous communities and local communities, indigenous people, to exercise decision-making design and have roles in climate programs and in finance instruments. There's a lot to be done in this space because environmental rights, and especially those of indigenous people, are those that are continuously transgressed and violated. But we also have to look at what was also promised, which was about new ways of doing business. 28 countries pledged to protect forests while promoting development and trade through the Forest, Agriculture and Commodity Trade Roadmap. This is new and is very big. 12 companies with major global markets share in commodities such as soy, palm oil, cocoa and cattle made some commitments to halt forest loss associated with their businesses. More is needed in this space, but this is a good first step. Now we all need to hold everyone and each other to account to ensure that these pledges and these promises are actually delivered. And we also saw that over 30 financial institutions that together manage over $8 trillion in assets made a commitment to work on eliminating agricultural commodity-driven deforestation risks in their investments and lending portfolios by 2025. Again, we salute that, and obviously now we all need to make sure that these promises are delivered. Here in Nairobi, at the 5th United Nations Environment Assembly, which took place in February and March of this year, we saw a further strong commitment to acting for nature and for the Sustainable Development Goals. We had a political declaration that emanated from our celebration of our 50th anniversary, and that declaration stressed the urgent need to halt the decline of biodiversity and to halt the fragmentation of habitats. And then we had 4 resolutions that sort of had a focus on biodiversity and health and nature-based solutions and animal welfare. Now, we also saw a definition passed in a resolution at UNEA on what makes up and how do we define nature-based solutions. Now, that might sound a little bit esoteric, but actually it provides an important basis so that we can start building on real solutions and, let's be honest, prevent greenwashing, prevent the abuse of the little words nature-based solutions, and ensure that we all deliver according to certain standards when we protect, when we conserve, and when we restore sustainably, when we use sustainably in the ecosystems so that it benefits humanity and, of course, nature itself, and so that these actions have long-term sustainability. So the ask now is to move from terminology to substance, which is why member states and all communities and societies really have a job to do. Now, member states ask UNEP to begin the intergovernmental process and consultations on increasing financing for nature-based solutions. And it is clear here that the 3 Rio-based conventions, the Convention on Desertification, the Convention on Biodiversity, and the Convention on Climate, each have a role to play. These are, in a way, indivisible when it comes to nature-based solutions. And finally, at Stockholm, in the Stockholm Plus 50, where we remarked on the 50 years since 1972 when UNEP was created, and which we often see as the birth of the modern environmental movement. It was not a celebration, we have to say, but it was a meeting where we took stock of what we had done and achieved and what is yet to be done. That meeting showed that the world is ready to talk about and to begin to deliberate and make real system-wide transformation that place human well-being at the center of a healthy planet. Now, there are many skeptics around this, and I understand that, but the track record is that when we decide to make shifts in the environmental policy sphere at the global level, we actually can do that. We did it with Montreal Protocol, we've done it with pollutants that we've exited, and we are now seeking to do that on the climate crisis and indeed on the biodiversity crisis. These moves, therefore, that we made in Stockholm make perfect sense because nature-based solutions are a critical tool to overcome the many, many challenges that we face. If we think about it, nature-based solutions such as ecosystem restoration, they can provide 40% of the climate change mitigation effort until 2030. Now, don't get me wrong, nature-based solutions is not the answer only, obviously, to climate change. We have to decarbonize our economies, but nature-based solutions provide natural barriers to risk, such as storms and floods and zoonotic diseases. And of course, we know that nature-based solutions and nature itself are key to our health. Pharmaceuticals and medicines, well, yes, many of them come from nature. In a sense, nature is that security for our future diseases that are yet to emerge. And also we know that nature itself is really good for our health. Moving in nature is good for stress relief, is good for cardiovascular health, and is good for managing diabetes. And of course, we also know that kids who are exposed to nature have good cognitive development, and obviously this is something that we want for all our children. And of course, nature-based solutions play a significant role in how we produce our foods and agriculture. Look, how are we controlling pests? Is it through nature-friendly integrated pest management, or is it through socking our fields with insecticides and pesticides? How do we enhance fertilize the soil? Is it through overuse of fertilizer, or is it through sound agricultural management? These are the kind of things that we need to consider. And of course, what are the methane emissions from our agricultural production, and what can we do to reduce that? So, and then when we look at cities and nature-based solutions in cities, well, here we really have to think about how cities can become low carbon, how they can become resilient, how we can include nature in how we construct and plan for our cities. How do we take nature into cities so that we use the depression in our cities not to pave them over, but to have them as parks, and when they flood, they just flood and produce nice pollinators due to the flooding, and not to have that water just simply run off into our oceans and not recharge the aquifers. How do we integrate nature into the infrastructure that we build, such as green roofs and permeable pavements, to enable that water is again absorbed and cooling is augmented? And how do we use trees in the cities to cool and to provide greater shade and obviously create more livable cities? These are the kind of things we need to integrate into our city development and our city zoning. And of course, nature-based solutions help indigenous people and local communities as well, because they thrive and they are the best stewards of biodiversity. And we understand, of course, that indigenous peoples make that real contribution to preserving nature and the natural environment. And when we look at jobs and nature-based solutions, we're seeing some really interesting statistics beginning to emerge, although more work is needed. And we at UNEP are in fact issuing a report later this year that deals with jobs and nature-based solutions and how that hangs together. But we understand that decent jobs, green jobs, lasting jobs are provided by nature-based solutions, and we want to do an assessment of how much that provision of jobs is and how that can really boost economic development and poverty reduction. So what we need to talk about is how do we boost all of these solutions and how can we capitalize on some of the key moments and events that are going to happen in the months and year ahead. Well, first of all, we obviously need to look at the next climate meeting, the next COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. We need to here see real ambition, and it means building on the Glasgow nature agenda and looking at more of putting nature-based solutions inside the national determined contributions so that we can really show the contribution that nature-based solutions make to climate management and to climate change mitigation and adaptation. In the context of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which will land at COP15 later this year, the Biodiversity COP, we need to make sure that that agreement is real, is clear, is monitorable, is ambitious, is implementable, and that it has strong backing by member states and by society at large. Having that whole of government commitment to biodiversity is critical. Now, we had the fourth open-ended working group just concluding here in Nairobi a couple of days back, and we saw some progress, but frankly, not as much as we had hoped on the text. So a second meeting, or another meeting, is going to happen prior to the biodiversity COP, and it'll be critical then that we nail down this clear ambition, the clear monitorable targets, as well as a clear commitment to the whole of government and to the implementation dimension. But we also need to think about the three Rio conventions, the Climate Convention, the Biodiversity Convention, and the Desertification Convention, and how we can integrate the nature-based solution story within these three conventions, and frankly, also within others, such as CITES, CMS, World Heritage, etc. But these conventions and the indivisibility of the Rio conventions really comes to show when we are talking about nature-based solutions, because in nature and managing nature-based solutions, we are contributing to all of the three Rio Convention priorities. And then, of course, we have the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, launched a couple of years ago, and that decade shows how we can simultaneously tackle the biodiversity loss, climate change, and yes, poverty, with investments in nature-based solutions, in green infrastructure, in the kind of protection that nature provides, and in smart integration of nature inside our built environment. That has the potential to generate trillions of dollars in ecosystem services, and of course in greenhouse gas removal, and so on and so forth. And then we need to remember that each year, each day that we delay on all these actions across climate and the nature and the pollution agenda, each day of delay and foot dragging, each day of not making the payments that we promised, each day of not taking the actions that we actually have on our books and the pledges that we have made, each day the costs just go up and the calamity in the future and even the present become higher. So that is why we absolutely have to accelerate investments in nature and accelerate that right now. We understand and know that investments need to triple by 2030 if we are to meet the climate, the biodiversity, and the desertification's commitment to the land neutrality targets. And currently, only $133 billion per year flow into nature-based solutions. And the majority of that comes from public finance. But we need to understand that the bigger amounts will not come from the public purse. So it'll have to come from private investments for nature-based solutions. And that has to be one of the central challenges of the next few years, and indeed one of the central commitments by member states, by companies, and by communities writ large. The public finance going alone is not good enough. Public finance has to leverage, where feasible of course, private finance. Because we can't have the public investing with taxpayers' money into nature and the private investing in its destruction. And that's why we need to have regulatory settings around public and private finance to ensure that it is all nature positive. We need to see the environment that enables investment. We need to include legislation that shifts harmful subsidies to nature positive subsidies. And this is within our grasp. We just need to make it happen. And as we engage with the private sector, we have to guard against greenwashing, because many corporations have, and we really salute them for that, made net zero and nature positive commitments. But it's very important now that we make sure that those commitments stand the scrutiny of the broader global community. And that is why the Secretary General has instituted a committee and a team that is looking at how can we drive greater transparency and accountability to hold the net zero commitments to account. Setting science-based targets is a very important first step, and this is beginning to happen across the board. So friends, the truth is that we have not treated nature as we should. In fact, we've treated nature quite badly in many places, and there can't really be any doubt about that. But nature is very resilient. Nature is forgiving. Actually, I often say that nature forgives our trespasses more than what we maybe know. So if we back nature-based solutions as one of the main ways to address that triple planetary crisis, humanity and nature can once again become allies. That's what we need to do, because if we give nature half the chance, it will bounce back. And then people and planet can thrive for centuries to come. Thank you.
So wonderful interventions from both Zach Goldsmith and Inga Andersen. A great scene setting for the day, and to really focus our minds on what we are going to do. So it now gives me pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Pam McElwee. Pam, do you want to take the stage?
Great. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Great. Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure. Thanks so much to Nat and the conference organizers for inviting me to briefly frame today's sessions, particularly provide some opening remarks from the researcher community. And I'm really delighted to do so, particularly because a lot of my current work is really immersed in these issues. So I'm leading, for example, the Ecosystems chapter and the ecosystems work for the US National Climate Assessment. This is a 4-year process which tends to alternate with the IPCC reports that the US does, the US government does. So that's ongoing right now. And I've also been lucky enough to be invited to co-chair the upcoming Ibes Nexus assessment. And this is an assessment that's going to cut across biodiversity, climate, food, water, and health. And so it's really at the heart of a lot of what the NbS interventions are all about. So I'm really immersed in this world. I'm excited to be here. It's also great to be back at Oxford, where I did my master's degree in forestry at the Plant Sciences Department, just around the corner. And I was down at Wadham, just down the road. So it's really lovely to be back in this corner of Oxford. So I thought I would use my brief time this morning to highlight some key issues, particularly around this biodiversity, climate, society nexus in particular. It's really exciting to see so many people engaged with NbS on these issues. This conference is really proof positive that we're thinking about these and the complexity that this nexus involves. And it's really proof positive that this is widely accepted, in the policy world as well, as our two previous speakers noted. We don't need to say really anymore that, natural climate solutions are 21% of the current net annual emissions of the US, right? We're sort of beyond that. And the questions I think we face now are not really just about what NbS are and why we should support them, but we're really about where are they going to happen, how are they going to happen, and for whom. And so I'd like to suggest that we're essentially moving from sort of promise and potential to something more about pragmatics and power. How do we actually institutionalize NbS as the default? And I think there's a lot of advances in these realms. In China, for example, many urban areas are adopting sponge city approaches to build NbS into flood resilience. In the US, the Biden administration made an announcement on Earth Day that they're going to be identifying new opportunities for NbS across the federal government, as well as a really important change to the Federal Emergency Management Administration, or FEMA, which allows local communities to essentially use other than cost-benefit analysis to make the case for nature-based solutions. And this is a huge, huge policy step, which is going to be a great step forward for NbS. But alongside these successes, we also need to ask where NbS is not happening, and that's where the power and the pragmatics are really important. So to give a personal example, suburban New Jersey in the US, where I live, had a massive flood from Hurricane Ida last fall. My house basically flooded when I was at the World Conservation Congress, and I came home to basically a disaster, partially in part because of what choices our neighbors had made, individual property owners, and the decisions that they make about impervious surfaces influenced the floods that happened in my house. And so how do we actually deal with those sort of fragmented issues? Vietnam, where I do a lot of my research work. The Mekong Delta is facing multiple pressures from sand mining, groundwater use. This is leading to subsidence combined with sea level rise and deteriorating environmental conditions. And there's essentially no large-scale use of NbS that could tackle these problems. So we have a long way to go in many places to actually institutionalize NbS and to give it the power to compete against other constituencies and approaches. And so I hope we can use this conference over the next few days to do that. So in today's talk, I'd really like to focus in on some exciting places where research is really happening to think about moving from that promise to pragmatics. So I want to talk briefly about 3 current areas of work that I think are really expanding and exciting, and that is thinking about trade-offs in NbS, thinking about values, and thinking about governance issues. And then I'd like to wrap up a bit by pointing us in some future research directions where I'd like to see a lot more. And some of this we will be discussing this week, so I'm excited for those. Thinking about NbS and financing, the various mechanisms we have, NbS and health, and finally what NbS and transformative change might mean. And so the reason why I pick those particular topics is because I feel like oftentimes they are left out of the discussions of NbS. They're sort of implicit, but we need to make them explicit. And I think this figure, I don't mean to pick on the authors of this figure, but I think this figure is a great example of approaches to NbS that really focus in on, well, where can we put NbS in place? You know, what benefits can we get out of it? Well, we can get some abstract benefits, reduce flood risk, reduce heat stress, and so forth. And then that's going to help us identify where NbS can go in. And to me, this diagram is missing a lot of questions about where might there be some trade-offs between the various functions, where might there be trade-offs between beneficiaries of NbS, where might values that different beneficiaries have come into play in terms of the acceptance of NbS, and how might governance structures be put in place to help achieve the aims of NbS. So I feel like those things that are sort of implicit need to be made much more explicit. And there's a lot of great research going on that I'd like to highlight that is doing just that. So the first topic is really around trade-offs. And we know, for example, there's a lot of biophysical trade-offs across the climate and biodiversity nexus. So this is a figure that came out of last year's joint Ibes IPCC report on biodiversity and climate change, which I and several other people who are here at this conference were involved in. And essentially what it said is just about everything we do for biodiversity is generally good for the climate, but the same can't be said for the reverse. That a lot of things that we might do for climate have negative biodiversity outcomes. And so it really points out that there are some significant trade-offs that we need to account for. And that goes for NbS as well. You know, even though we want NbS to be multifunctional, I think we need to acknowledge that a lot of NbS interventions have the potential to result in trade-offs. And if we can make these trade-offs explicit, I think we're going to get better outcomes in the end. So we can think about some examples of these trade-offs. So some coastal NbS measures might reduce public access to beaches and shorelines, while reforestation can potentially introduce competition, land use competition with food production. And of course, there's the most sort of unproductive type of trade-off, in my opinion, and as Nat mentioned at the beginning, where NbS is used in these offset type programs in return for continued fossil fuel emissions. Thereby, the impact of the NbS is totally diminished. So we want to try to do a better job of recognizing, acknowledging, and trying to plan for these trade-offs. But as a recent study of ecosystem-based adaptation found, quote, only 16% of articles acknowledged any potential trade-offs at all or negative consequences of EBA, and the distribution of these trade-offs was barely mentioned. So we're missing, if we in the research community are not really digging into these trade-offs and acknowledging them, we're really missing some problems. And at the same time, looking for these trade-offs And seeing where they happen can help us make better decisions. So, for example, several recent studies have suggested that combinations of green infrastructure with gray infrastructure, rather than just one or the other alone, may be more accepted than just NbS on its side, by itself. So does this give us a hint? Is this a result of the acknowledgement of trade-offs? And how could we extend this to lessons elsewhere? These are the sorts of things we in the research community can really help with. I'd like to suggest that there's different types of trade-offs. We can be asking questions not just about those biophysical trade-offs. We could be asking questions about governance trade-offs, scale and temporal trade-offs, and particularly benefits trade-offs. And this is going to require more attention to how NbS approaches and benefits and costs are spread among stakeholders. And this is going to be really essential for long-term support for NbS interventions. We know from several recent studies that there's a lot of potential positive benefits across employment, health, welfare, and so forth. One recent study that came out in 2021 that was looking specifically across ecological infrastructure projects found that 51% of cases were reporting positive employment benefits. That's great. It's great to hear that. But all too often, these sorts of studies fail to disclose how different groups get those benefits. So employment may just be for men and not women, right? So projects that, for example, only involve local communities in labor for tree planting can be economically and culturally unsustainable. So we have to ask deeper questions other than that we get some employment. We need to ask deeper questions about who gets the employment and how, and for how long. So I'd like to suggest that there's actually some worrying trends in the literature, and that is that we see higher levels of knowledge and acceptance of NbS has been found primarily among those with higher income and higher levels of formal education. And there's a real danger in focusing only on these populations to the exclusion of others. This is particularly the case where costs of NbS are going to have to be borne by some. And there's a lot of emerging examples of where these trade-offs are borne by the poorest, unfortunately. For example, there's a growing green gentrification literature, particularly in the United States, which has shown that some NbS interventions like green infrastructure, particularly around stormwater, have some very serious justice implications, but that these justice and equity issues are rarely discussed in planning documents or policy implementation. And the work of Fuchsia Hoover, who's one of my colleagues on the National Climate Assessment, has been really important in this regard. So this is a huge problem if NbS is going to result in different forms of displacement. And this is something that we're seeing in Vietnam in particular, where my research team has been working on the impacts of floods, particularly in the Red River Delta. And one of the issues we looked at in one of our research studies was the impact of a massive 2008 flood in which a barrier system, which had been constructed by the French decades ago and which had never been used, had to be used in 2008 to keep floods from going into the Hanoi city center. Well, no one had told the communities that had settled in the floodplains that this barrier was functional and that it was about to be used. Households were given 2 hours advanced warning that they were about to be flooded by the opening of this barrier gate. And so we did some research 2 years later in 2010, where we found that about half the households essentially got a foot or more of water in their house for several weeks. And we talked to them about, what sort of solutions that they would suggest for avoiding this in the future. And the problem, though, is to suggest NbS makes sense, but the problem is it will involve things like land acquisitions. It will involve things like potential displacement. And when talking with households, they often suggested that they're willing to take the short-term pain of flood for several weeks, in which many of their household items were destroyed, over the uncertainty of long-term displacement of land and risks. Particularly around problems of land acquisition that have to do with corruption, worries about people taking land and not getting compensation for it, and so forth. So these are some real issues that we need to think about in terms of trade-offs. And one place where we could look for some really good research in terms of benefit trade-offs is in the extensive literature on payments for ecosystem services, which has been going on for several decades now. And just a shout out to one of my recent PhD students from Vietnam who did a study recently that's out right now in ecosystem services, looking at different types of benefits across different types of communities, and finding that in some cases, only individual benefits from payments for ecosystem services were accruing to households. In other places, there were collective benefits, but there often wasn't a chance to do both. There were trade-offs between those individual and collective benefits. So I urge people to read her paper. I think it's really great at thinking about how, for example, a payments for ecosystem program that had strong collective patrolling actually didn't provide very much monetary incentive to individual households. And so we need analysis of these types of benefit sharing agreements for NbS as well. I think there'll be a really welcome development to dealing with trade-offs. The next area that I think there's some really exciting work going on is on the question of values. How do we incorporate values into NbS? And this is particularly the case as a lot of critiques of NbS have been that it's overly instrumental. It's aimed at essentially treating worlds as somewhat interdependent, human and social systems as separate from one another, and oftentimes overly dominated by economic approaches. And Indigenous peoples in particular have expressed concern about engaging with NbS for these reasons. And we're going to be hearing a lot about that in panel 4, I think it is tomorrow. Thinking about relational values and putting those in NbS, I'd like to suggest is a really important area of research. And this would include thinking about NbS through narratives of care, thinking about kinship and reciprocity. And a lot of this is recognizing what Indigenous peoples have been doing in terms of care for land and coastal areas based on culturally specific worldviews, and applying principles and indicators such as health of land, caring for country, and so forth. And learning from these examples can really help us build values into NbS. There's some great case studies, I think, for example, of the Balinese water management system in Southeast Asia known as Subak, where water, land, people, spirits, and animals are managed together in what they themselves would never call an NbS, but it clearly fits those sort of multifunctional approaches. So expanding our conception of values can help us improve our NbS interventions. And I'd like to provide a really brief case study of the Tulalu tribes in the Pacific Northwest, where an NbS intervention was really built to be multifunctional and multi-objective. It was aimed at resilience for salmon restoration, really aimed at the health of both human communities and farmers nearby, with aims towards food supply, improving a recognition of tribal culture and traditional knowledge, as well as environmental quality. And that involved planting living fences along the river corridors where salmon runs existed. It helped prevent damage to nearby farmers, thereby enrolling them as allies in this NbS intervention, as well as protecting river habitat and the salmon themselves. And all of this was put together through stakeholder coalitions, where a cultural narrative was a major part of the management documents for this NbS. And this cultural narrative was combined with scientific background and knowledge to really talk about the cultural implications of management decisions. And it's been a very successful model. So there's, I think, a lot of ways that values can be part of this. It helps reduce conflicts and manage those trade-offs that we just talked about. It increases capacity and support for NbS, makes more diverse coalitions of farmers and fisherfolk and Indigenous communities, for example, and the one I just gave. But we have some challenges. There's a lot of decision support tools that are used for NbS that don't include values. They don't, for example, include values in some of the tools like INVEST or the benefits estimation tool and so forth, because these are really challenging to try to incorporate, particularly in qualitative measures. And so we really need deliberative tools. So cost-benefit analysis tools can't be the only thing in our toolbox. We really need some new deliberative tools to think about values and local indicators and benefits. So the next area where there's a lot of exciting work going on is in NbS and governance. How do we prioritize NbS in decision making? There have been several recent studies really talking about prioritizing, protect, manage, and restore in that order. And again, this is a great example of I'd like to see even more in a diagram like this. I'd like to see governance. I'd like to see what does it mean in terms of policy decisions where we have an NbS that's primarily focused on protection versus one that's focused on restoration, which requires different policies, which requires different coalitions to create political space for NbS, and which of these contribute to the building of capacity for local communities to engage in those governance systems as well. So we are getting a lot of good studies of governance, and I do have a lot of citations in this presentation, and I'm happy to share that so everyone can read these studies, because I'd really like people to get to look at some of the details of them, because they really are helpful for thinking through these challenges. We're getting a lot of sense of, governance requires a lot of existing capacity. We need personnel, financial resources, supportive legal frameworks, cooperation across stakeholders. Stakeholder engagement is a big part of this as well, particularly if NbS can be co-designed with stakeholders. We need alignment and integration across institutional structures and scales, particularly through polycentric designs. We need potential experimentation windows, ongoing research and monitoring and partnerships, clear demonstration of co-benefits, and the availability of multiple sources of finance. These are all good ideas to help us move forward in terms of good governance. There's two aspects of this that I think there's a lot of work going on that I'd like to point people to. One is around stakeholder engagement. There's been some mixed evidence, actually, on stakeholder engagement in NbS. Some studies have shown that a high degree of participant involvement tends to report positive outcomes across more socioeconomic dimensions, while other studies have reported some dangers like stakeholder fatigue, not in my backyardism for NbS, landowner disputes, and so forth. And so there's some mixed evidence on stakeholders. And so I would like to encourage the research community to do more on these sorts of stakeholder mappings and analysis to give us a sense of not just how these stakeholders differ in terms of how they engage with NbS, but how coalitions can be built and what are the tools we need for that. Because it's really clear that there's a lot of danger in not recognizing those stakeholder coalitions that could be built and not including all of the affected people in NbS issues. And so this particular study of eco-disaster risk reduction in Brazil pointed out that even though it was a well-meaning project that was focused on stabilizing landslides and some of the favelas that are built in sloping lands around Rio, there was a real need to engage with stakeholders in those communities. But the high degree of informality in these favelas meant that it wasn't clear who was really in charge. City government tended to dismiss them as poor and not well educated, and so they really weren't actively engaged in the design, the co-design of these projects. Trees were planted by external actors, but there were a lot of security issues. And so it was just basically a case study of how not to do a project because so many stakeholders were not engaged with one another. So we want to avoid those, and we want to try to think across stakeholder issues. We also want to think across integration issues, not just in terms of stakeholders, but issues themselves. And this is particularly true because we want to design those NbS that cut across the nexus of climate and biodiversity and society, or food, water, and health. We have a lot of nexus issues. And in fact, you would think that there would be more literature on NbS for the nexus. But as we're finding out in this nexus assessment that I'm working on, and we're just now getting started, A lot of these nexus issues are mentioned or they're implicit, but they're not actually dug into in very much depth. And so I'd like to really encourage the research community to do more of this, to think about, where we have a nexus of, say, water, food, and energy within particular NbS projects. What does that actually mean in terms of the governance mechanisms that would be needed for each? Particularly because, as we know, so many ministries of food are separate from a ministry of energy, which might be separate from a department or a ministry for water. And this is particularly the case in Vietnam. To do an urban agriculture gardening project that cuts across the water, food, energy nexus, you would have to be involved with 6 or 7 different local authorities and departments. And so it's that sort of lack of integration that really presents major barriers to our successful NbS. So now I'd like to move very quickly to just 3 areas where I feel like there's just been an explosion of work, and the research community is just now starting to put pen to paper to actually capture this. And that's around financing. We have so many questions about what sort of financing is appropriate for NbS and which is going to be more successful. These are questions like offset versus aid, public versus private, whether we want to have a balance between that public funding that Inger mentioned previously, philanthropy, the private sector. There's all sorts of explosion of blue bonds, insurance values, impacts on sovereign debt markets, and so forth. And particularly in the private sector, I think this is where a lot of questions are being raised, right? So according to Net Zero Tracker, nearly 40% of companies that are thinking about net zero pledges intend to use offsets of some kind to achieve their net zero goals. But we know that these offsets have proven very difficult, both in the ones that we sort of know already, the voluntary carbon market, and ones that might be coming down the pike. So the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets has had a bit of a rocky rollout around this. Article 6 of Paris is still really quite vague. It's really going to be the burdens on the research community to help answer some key questions here. And some of these questions might be things like, do donor-financed NbS compared to business-financed NbS, which tend to be more inclusive of stakeholders? Those are questions that we in the research community can answer. Do businesses that rely on reducing emissions in their own supply chains, is that going to be more sustainable than a business that goes straight to offsets? I think implicitly the answer is yes, but let's find out. Let's dig into some of these businesses and do that research. And it's particularly worrying, this whole financial world, given what was funded in sort of post-COVID financing approaches and recovery approaches. And so just for Southeast Asia, essentially nothing in any of the COVID recovery packages had anything to do with NbS. And in fact, there was a bunch of terrible stuff put in that actually might make NbS harder in the future, like reducing environmental taxes and so forth. So we have a real challenge to think about the problems with financing. So on NbS and health, I'd like to suggest, again, health is often implicit. So this is an example from the Global Adaptation Commission report that came out in 2019. A lot of concern over lost lives across different places where NbS can be included, but there's oftentimes not as much digging into the details of health. And so how, for example, how NbS might lead to us having some potential disservices. How might NbS interventions that, for example, might increase pollen near communities, therefore exaggerating asthma, or NbS that might lead to an explosion of ticks. And this is very personal for me because I almost didn't make this conference because I was hospitalized with Lyme disease 3 weeks ago by being out in nature. And part of that is mismanagement in New Jersey of our deer populations related to how we manage the peri-urban interface. So there's a lot of questions around health, and I'd like to urge the research community to be more explicit about those health and NbS interlinkages. And finally, on transformative change. This is a really buzzy topic. There's going to be a new Ibes assessment on transformative change, which is happening at the same time as the Nexus. And what this actually means is essentially taking NbS to help us move beyond incremental change to something that is truly transformative, that allows us to have equitable and just transformations, that allows us to have durable change across different scales and different sectors. And how do we actually do that is the big question. And how NbS can be part of our toolkit is something that researchers are really doing some exciting work on. And I'd like to encourage more folks to frame their studies in this way. And so we have a paper out in Bioscience right now, actually, that came out of the IPCC Ibes Biodiversity and Climate Report last year. It's open access right now. There's a podcast, got to plug that. And one of the things that we tried to do in that report is think about what transformative change looks like. So we came up with some principles around thinking about multifunctionality, innovate across scales, creating those coalitions of stakeholder support, building in equitability, and thinking about positive social tipping points. And I'd like to suggest that these are all things that apply equally to NbS interventions as well. So I'd like to close it there. Also get in a plug for an upcoming call for papers. I've just encouraged the research community to do a lot of different things. And as you're doing that, where are you going to send that? Hopefully you'll send it to lots of different places, but PLOS Climate and PLOS Water, and PLOS Climate is one that I'm particularly working with, is going to have a special call very soon on nature-based solutions for climate and water. And so think about that as one of your places that you'll send all this new exciting work. So I look forward to reading it and seeing it and citing it in the Nexus assessment as that goes forward. So thanks very much.